This video will be part 1 of Chapter 6, Love and Sexuality for PSY 345, Human Sexual Behavior. One of the biggest challenges early in psychology's history was what to do with the human experience of love. And a good chunk of the problem had to do with resistance on the part of the emerging science of psychology to even own the concept. In many ways, psychology early in its history was very resistant to studying these intangibles, things like emotion and motivation, and they were especially resistant to studying the most intense emotional experiences, especially those that were seen as positive, such as love. Studies of anger and hostility and even aggression weren't off limits, but love certainly tended to be. So it's only relatively recent history in psychology that there's been a serious study of the experience, both at a psychological level as well as a biological level, of this experience that is so human. What's understood, and there are very few things in this research literature that can be agreed upon, is that there's a wide range of human experiences of what we call love. You could argue that it exists on a continuum, and some researchers have described this range of experiences from romanticism, which is very consistent with the common American kind of story arc of romance, of seeing someone across a crowded room and locking eyes with them, and that goes hand in hand with the belief that you have a true love, you have your person out there waiting for you, and also the idea, this conceptualization that if you love each other, all things that come in your path can be resolved. This notion of love conquering all. So a lot of our storytelling narratives about love are in this romantic vein. On the other end of this continuum, you have a hyper-realistic vision of love, where love is assumed to be something that develops over time with the deepening of knowledge of the other person, and has a more practical value to it, that you're not seeing sort of this. I always look at romanticism as sort of the disease model of love, where you're literally infected by this other person and you can't stop being with them, whereas the realist view is the idea that you actually have to invest time to know someone well enough to love them. So there are many people on this realistic end of the continuum who argue that love can be experienced. It can also lose its power. So people can fall in love. They can also fall out of it, and they can have numerous forms of loving relationships with different kinds of people. And the realist view is also that there are things in the world that can destroy love. You can't conquer all things just because you feel strongly towards someone. Now, there have been some popular theories of conceptualizing or operationalizing what we mean by love. Sternberg's is probably the most well-known of these theories. Sternberg characterized love in this triangular model, or the triangular theory of love. He felt that there were 3 basic components of the love experience. One component is intimacy, the second is passion, and the third is commitment. Now, Sternberg's experience here, he was coming at it from the point of view that if people match well in terms of their valuing of these 3 components, then their relationships are likely to be gratifying and successful. If they don't match well, they may have problems. So if one person is extremely high in intimacy, but lower in passion, and very high in commitment, but their partner is all in on passion, but low on commitment, that can be problematic for people. He also made the argument that if you have kind of this perfect balance of intimacy, passion, and commitment, he described that as consummate love, where you have all three components and they're relatively equivalent in their importance to the person. When you have relationships, and he wasn't just talking about committed romantic relationships, he also characterized other kinds of love relationships, such as friendships, where you have high degrees of intimacy without the other components, without the component of passion in particular. If you have, say, a best friend or a deep friendship, that may in fact involve high degrees of intimacy and a commitment to that friendship. On the romantic side, when you have romantic love, you have intimacy and passion. You may not yet have commitment in that relationship. If there's passion without intimacy, meaning that your passion, and that tends to be in Sternberg's description of it, that high degree of sexual attraction. Without intimacy, you have more of this fatuous style. It could involve an intense amount of need for commitment and locking the person down, but it lacks all of the knowledge. So kind of the point of Sternberg's model is, love can be defined along these various continua, and the degree to which your experience of a relationship is positive depends on a variety of factors, and without knowing any one of those, you wouldn't be able to determine the outcome. Sternberg used his model to describe several types of relationships that people might have. There can be a non-love relationship, a relationship that is purely transactional. So you don't have intimacy, you don't have passion, and you don't have commitment. You can have friendships, basic liking friendships. You have intimacy where you know the person well, but you don't have the passion and commitment issues that would characterize a romantic relationship. Infatuation, which he didn't necessarily describe as a positive thing, although it's often characterized in Western cultural context as the first stage of falling in love. Infatuation is high passion, but nothing else. So, that desperate kind of feeling of wanting to think about and be with and involve oneself with this other person without any real knowledge of who they are or any real concept of what it would be like to have a life with them. Romantic love includes, the critical difference between infatuation and romantic love, which characterizes more in Sternberg's model dating relationships that are still fairly casual. You have intimacy and passion, which in a Western context is often described as, just romance. But there's not yet a commitment that makes that relationship exclusive. Companionate love is often described as more later stage relationships, but it's not necessarily the case that it be a relationship that has lasted a long time. Some people form companionate relationships from the start. Companionate love is described as high degrees of intimacy and commitment, but passion is a lower priority for the individuals involved. And this need not be, the outcome of a dating or an intimate relationship like a partner. You can also have highly deep companionate love relationships between friends and family members as well. Fatuous love, as I mentioned on the previous slide, is where you have high degrees of passion and this sort of surface commitment that's kind of desperate, but there's no intimacy, so you don't really know the person, you don't understand them. It's just sort of I would describe it as being more desperate in a way. Empty love is where you have some sort of, you're bound in some way to the relationship, where there's a high degree of commitment, but you're not in love with the person, would be the common language. There's no passion, there's no intimacy. So these would be described as kind of strictly contractual relationships. And then sort of for Sternberg, his value judgment on this, the ideal, the ultimate in love relationships is consummate, where you have, whether you're talking about a marriage or some other kind of long-term intimate relationship, where you have intimate knowledge, passion, and physical attraction, as well as commitment. Now another theory, and it hits some of the same notes, Hendrick and Hendrick is described by your authors as a somewhat different approach, using different language. They talk about the idea of eros representing passionate love, so that echoes what Sternberg argued. But they weren't limiting eros in terms of passionate quality to just physical sexual desire, but also being, these really strong emotions driving the connection to the other person. Ludus they referred to as game playing. So this is when people are engaged in the fun of dating, the fun of relationships, whether you're talking about whether sex is involved or not. People are engaging in it for the fun of it, as opposed to trying to fashion a life with someone or to engage in getting, deep meaning or whatever. Storge, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that properly, is more descriptive of friendships. It's more companionate. It's more, it doesn't typically involve any of that passion, and particularly not physical sexual attraction that would characterize other forms of relationship. But these are deep, intimate connections. So this would be like Sternberg's description of someone who has high degrees of intimacy with another person. Pragma is very practical. You have people who engage in their connections to each other because they help each other achieve goals. Those goals may be, let's not be lonely, let's have each other to keep each other company, let's have children together, let's maintain a home, have someone to travel with, whatever. But the orientation is more pragmatic, that you're two people who have the same interests or you have the same goals and you fit, but there may not be that kind of passion and physical attractiveness, but it represents a different nature to the relationship. Mania is kind of what Sternberg described as that fatuous quality, where Hendrick and Hendrick use these terms of being jealous and obsessive in your attraction. So it's kind of like Sternberg's description of having the passion and the desire for commitment without the intimate knowledge that is required to have a meaningful commitment. So, what Sternberg would describe as fatuous, Hendrick and Hendrick are describing as manic. Agape is described in this model as a love style that involves selfless self-sacrifice or a giving orientation, where there may be elements of passion, there may be elements of friendship, but there's the primary organizing principle for this person is giving to the other. So in Hendrick and Hendrick's model, there's less of an emphasis of trying to determine, exactly what's the match. Although you could extend from the model, if you had a person who was on this highly possessive, dependent love side of the model, but the person that they are attempting to have a relationship with is really just into game playing, that's a really volatile combination. You have somebody who's a little bit manipulative They really are into relationships for fun. If they're connecting with a person who's possessive and dependent, there's going to be a lot of fireworks there. If you have a person who is high on the valuing of romantic or passionate love, but the person they are interested in is more pragmatic, those two may find it difficult to satisfy each other's relative needs as well. So you can see how these theories can play into looking at the mismatch and how those mismatches could play into low relationship satisfaction and predicting relationship failure. The ideal is when you have a good fit between what people express as their own love style. And there's another model out there called love languages. You can Google it and take a test yourself to see what love language you tend to lean toward. And it can be instructive, at least for a thought tool to do so. The assumption is that if you become more aware of what your love style is, it may give you some insight into ways in which you can improve your relationship, deepen your relationship, especially in understanding who your partner is. For instance, if you're a high pragmatist and you kind of have a tendency to keep score in your relationship, like who does nice things for who and how often and are things getting done and so on and so on, if you're very goal-directed in that way, but your partner is high on romance and passion, you can come to some agreements that I will work harder on doing some romantic things to feed your need for passion and romance, and you will do some practical things to help feed my need for order and goal attainment as well. So what therapists might engage with, not necessarily using this specific model or even Sternberg's, is having lots of conversations with couples if they're struggling to identify what their values, needs, and expectations are. So these sorts of examinations can be useful in that respect. Now we do need to spend some time kind of trying to draw a distinction between love and sex. We tend to conflate the two and kind of leave them ill-defined. And by we, I mean we as a culture tend to have fairly convoluted definitions of these words. But also as social scientists, we tend to be fairly fluid in the way we define the connection between love and sex. So what are some ways in which these words are used in similar ways? Well, both are characterized both in popular culture as well as in the scientific literature as being connected to strong feelings. And they typically are described as strong positive feelings. So when people are asked to describe love and when they are asked to describe their sexual experiences, they tend to describe intense positive things. Both have been demonstrated, whether you're talking about love or the experience of sex, both come prepackaged with physiological experiences. So at the body-brain level, there are changes when we are, one specific example, they did, some researchers did functional MRI scans where they had people in the MRI machine and they had them either think about a friend or a workmate, someone at work, or the person they loved the most. And sometimes that was defined as an intimate partner or a marriage partner, a relationship partner, or a very, very close friend. And they found clear brain differences in what areas of the brain were active when people were thinking about these different kinds of connections. And the areas of the brain that were the most active when people thought about an intimate lover tended to be more connected to those reward centers, those powerful reward centers that are associated with really intense, positive, enjoyable feelings. There's also, for both, the experience of love and the experience of sex, there's a set of beliefs and ideas and constructs and schemas that are layered on top of them. And that's, human beings are thinking creatures. We have to try to make sense of what we're experiencing. And by making sense of what we're experiencing, we have to try and categorize it and create some order out of it. So, we have love scripts of all sorts. They're infused with gender roles and expectations, timelines, and so on. Sex is kind of the same way. We have like a model in our heads of what sex is supposed to look like, what it's supposed to feel like, and we are constantly engaged in this pattern of comparing what we're actually experiencing with what we expect. So there's a cognitive component to both. Both may be expressed in a lot of different ways. In other words, there are tremendous individual differences in the expression and experience of both love and sexuality. For both, drag your memory back to when you studied Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs. The need for love is in that middle zone of the hierarchy of needs, so love and esteem. Sex is at the base. Sex is along with the basic biological needs. And Maslow argued that for both the experience of love and the experience of sex, these are deprivation state needs. When we don't have connections to others, whether it's in this broadly emotionally defined construct of love or the physical act of sex and sexual satisfaction, when we don't have them, Maslow argued we are in a deprivation state. And the research evidence tends to support that people, when they don't have these things and they feel a need, what they're experiencing is deprivation. Now, how they differ, people tend to state that when they don't have love in some form in their lives, that they experience acute sadness. The absence of sex, it may be disappointing, but people don't describe the same aching loss and lack that they do when they describe the absence of being loved or being able to love another. So that leads researchers to argue that human happiness is really dependent on the experience of loving others and being loved by others. And that's not necessarily in the context of a sexual relationship. That can be in a lot of different forms. Not being loved is a deeply human, painful experience. Not having a sexual partner or not being able to achieve sexual satisfaction in whatever form you desire is a source of dissatisfaction, but it's not associated with overall the depth of unhappiness that we see when people lack love. Love is described as a pervasive experience, meaning it tends to infuse itself into multiple aspects of personality and multiple aspects of experience. Sex, as your authors put it, tends to be localized. So the experience of having sex and experiencing sexual gratification tends to be shorter in time frame. So you have it, and then you're not having it. So it tends to be bounded. It tends to be somewhat time limited. Whereas love tends to persist outside of context. Even when the person isn't physically present, love still exists. So that's what your authors mean by love being pervasive. And even if someone passes away, the love you have for them is still there. It's still present, no matter how long that person is gone. We also tend to see greater selectivity in our love relationships than we do in sexual relationships. Now, you might be thinking that doesn't make sense. Human beings are pretty picky about who they have sex with. Well, love tends to require investment. It tends to require greater intimacy, greater knowledge, greater time. When we describe ourselves as loving someone, we tend to know them and we tend to invest in them. Sex may or may not be that way. Sex may be transitory, it may be temporary. It definitely doesn't necessarily have the same kind of staying power that love tends to. Now, a relatively newer phenomenon, or at least the name for it is relatively newer. I can't imagine that there hasn't been a time in human history where hookups weren't a thing that happened. It's just that we've named it and have, as psychologists, have studied it more intentionally than they have in the past, especially with the growing interest in quote-unquote hookup culture, particularly on college campuses. But, to be clear, hooking up is something human beings have always done, where you have some casual kind of sexual connections that involve limited to no strings, and are purely kind of for the purposes of sexual gratification. So essentially, a hookup is defined in the research literature as connecting with someone, becoming sexually involved that same day, no commitment, and no expectation thereof beyond that encounter. There has been research showing that on college campuses, among college students, this has become a fairly commonplace narrative, although there is some dispute as to exactly how common it is. So many college students believe that hookup culture is really powerful on their campuses, but when you look at the actual data, far fewer college students are actually engaging in it regularly than you would expect based on the amount of talk there is about it. Not all students approve of it or engage in hooking up, but there are large percentages of undergraduates who report hooking up at least once while they're in college. It varies from campus to campus, with some campuses having a much more normative practice of hooking up, whereas in other campuses it's a little less so. Definitely the advent of smartphone applications that allow for quicker selection of a meetup partner has advanced the common nature of hookup experiences. In some cases, people are wanting to have sexual experiences, but they really want to delay investing in a committed relationship until later in their lives. So they're not going to deny themselves the fun and entertainment of sexual relationships and the excitement in some ways of the hookup atmosphere, but they know they're not looking for a partner. So what tends to show up in these research studies is that people are not intending, they're not really dating. They're simply into a fairly game-playing oriented set of activities. Now, attitude-wise, males have been found to report more positive attitudes towards having sex with strangers generally. And that's regardless of whether you're talking about heterosexual males, bisexual males, or homosexual males. They tend to be more open to the idea of having sex with strangers than females. And that's, again, regardless of the sexual orientation of the females you're discussing. So females tend to be, even when hookup culture is strong, there's a tendency for females to be a little more hesitant about it. That said, both male and female, both college students and outside of the college environment, they give similar reasons for why they're hooking up. They just want to have sex, or they want to experiment. They don't want to have to go through all of the song and dance of trying to date someone. They want physical pleasure, and they want it now. many often report, and this is especially true in the college student data, most college students who are engaging in hooking up, there's some alcohol use that's involved, and I'm sure that's shocking to all of you who are college students. And they also, both men and women, tend to report that attractiveness matters in who they're selecting to hook up with. If you have any baseline familiarity with the way these apps on your phone work, there's a lot of swiping left and right or whatever. And physical attractiveness tends to be the key feature that people are tagging on when they make their decisions. Now this is just an example. It's a very busy, statistics-heavy table, but I just wanted to reinforce some of these differences that we see. Now this is a sample. Please look at the top line. This is a sample of primarily white people. So that's my opening caveat. It's difficult to find research on most human behaviors that has a properly representative sample of people of the culture where the research is done. So that's my opening caveat, these high percentages of white people. Now we do have a decent number of individuals who are male and female, but most of the sample is heterosexual. So again, opening caveat, most of the research that we have available on hooking up is about heterosexual white people. So where are the gaps in the research? Studying anyone who isn't straight and white. And unfortunately, most of psychology suffers from this problem. So if you're someone, really interested in this area of research, maybe you're a psych major, this is a really wide open field for study. Now, with those opening caveats, what you notice is there are some pretty significant differences in pattern with who's willing to hook up. So saying, I have hooked up, where you have, decent percentages of straight men who say they have, and it's higher in percentage than the women who say they have. Now, the biggest difference is who says they won't do it ever, with more women saying they won't do it than men. And that's a pretty large difference. Now, you also see, when we look at gay men, that's where you have the highest percentage of people reporting that they have. Now, a part of that is in gay male culture among white people. Now, we have some evidence that is similar in samples of gay men who are black. We have much less data on any other population. So it's very hard to generalize beyond this very white sample. But what I'm trying to get at by showing this to you is that hooking up is not a simple, straightforward phenomenon. It's characterized, or it changes, it shifts based on where you are. So like the norms of your campus, for example, have something to say about hooking up. The social scripts that are normative in your particular social sphere. So if you're a bisexual person, you're female, you're also black, what are the sexual scripts in your social world? What does that world say about hooking up? So every person, based on their multiple identities, they're going to have different values and feelings about hooking up with strangers. And attitudes about hooking up are going to shift and change with the times too. So you have to kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about data. Lots of people think, hooking up is just every college student is hooking up every other day. And that's simply not the case. So the stereotypes of college students having rampant sex with strangers far outstrips the reality. It's a common experience, but it's not quite as common as the stereotype would suggest. One more concept to explore before we leave part one is this concept of friends with benefits. Like hooking up, human beings have been having sex with friends for as long as they've been human beings. So this idea of friends with benefits, in some cases what you're talking about is people who are absolutely very close, true friends, and their friendship has this element of sex being a part of it, but they don't define themselves as being a couple. So they don't see themselves as exclusive, they don't see themselves as committed. Since they are true friends, they're intimate, they know each other well and understand each other, but they occasionally have sex with each other as well. And often they'll describe this as, we're just so comfortable with each other, we know each other, we feel safe with each other, and it just happens sometimes. For some friends with benefits, dyads, or sometimes more than that, it is just about the sex. It's like, I need sex, you're my booty call. It's like that. That's about 12% in the research on this experience. For some people, what they're trying to do is connect with the right people. And, this idea of network opportunism, it is as easy as it sounds, where you have people who are saying, you know what, I'm going to use my sex appeal in order to get my foot in the door into this set of people. So they may use sex with friends in order to kind of increase their social capital, if you will. In some cases, you have people who successfully transition from being friends with benefits to actually being in a relationship. In some cases, it's unintentional. So some people may find themselves just sliding into a relationship when they didn't intend to. So the successful transition people are like, yeah, we're friends. We've been having sex. We're really good for each other. Let's choose to now move on to having a deeper relationship that includes a commitment. In unintentional transitions, it's either just sort of drifting into a commitment, not necessarily with a great deal of intimacy, or there could be situational changes that kind of lock people in to their relationship, such as an unexpected pregnancy, for example. In some cases, friends with benefits relationships fail. Sometimes that's because the people involved in them, one wants more and the other does not. And then things fall apart at that point. And then for some people, it's a way of getting out of the relationship that they're in. So let's say you have a committed relationship, but it's failing, and you decide, yeah, we're just going to be friends, and occasionally you hook up. That becomes kind of a friends with benefits relationship, but it's a way of, over time, those sexual interactions become fewer and fewer, so you're transitioning out of a committed relationship. Now, some research has shown that there are some advantages that people report, things they like about a friends with benefits relationship. It means you can have a sexual partner without having to deal with hookup culture. So they're a known quantity. You don't have to explain yourself to them. You don't have to have a lot of the preliminaries of setting boundaries or whatever. It minimizes risks if you know the person well and you know that they take precautions. Then it takes a lot of the anxiety out of it. At the same time, you don't have a commitment, so you feel free to explore other kinds of relationships with other people. On the downside, other people may see you as a person incapable of commitment, of real commitment, if you're engaging in sexual interactions with someone who's supposed to be your friend. So other people may perceive you as someone who takes advantage of others, who doesn't really care about emotional intimacy, and as a result, you may take some social blowback for what you're doing. There's also the assumptions that other people may have that you're just lying to yourself. For some people, they may be seen as taking advantage of the other person or allowing themselves to be taken advantage of by the other person. Some people report that they feel like over time, if all they have is friends with benefits sexual interactions, that they start to feel like all they can do is to have these very surface relationships. Even if it's someone they know and they care about in a kind of surface way, that it becomes less and less emotionally satisfying and more frustrating for them. So that concludes part 1 of chapter 6.